Okay, I think we'll make a start. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Charlie Bell. I work for the National Trust on the Stepping Stones project. And this is the first of what we hope might be a series of webinars about conservation within the Stepping Stones area. And I'll talk a little bit about the Stepping Stones project in a minute. So because this is the first webinar that we've done, we'll ask you for a little bit of feedback afterwards in a follow-up email about how you found tonight, and also if you have any ideas for future topics. So yeah, expect to see a follow-up email containing those things. So a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our speakers. We are going to be recording the webinar this evening, and there were a few people who couldn't make tonight and wanted to have a look online afterwards. So just to make you aware of that, if you don't want to appear on the recording, the easiest thing to do is just to turn your video off, and then we won't be able to see you. But just be aware of that, and be aware that if you do speak up or say anything or ask a question, then you will be recorded. There are a lot of us tonight, there's 33, and we might be joined by a few more. So I think you are all on mute by default. If you do happen to take yourself off mute for any reason, please just remember to mute yourself again when you finish speaking. You can get a lot of feedback when there's so many people and background noise. So it's just the easiest way of ensuring that we don't have those problems. For those of you who haven't used Zoom before or are maybe a bit less familiar, the best thing to do is to change the view to the speaker view. You can do that in the top right. You should be able to switch between gallery view, which is where you see all the faces staring back at you, or speaker view, which is where you just see the person who's speaking. For something like tonight, where we've got certain speakers doing presentations, I always find it much easier to have it on speaker view. So I recommend that option. I'll run through the running order in a minute, but I think instead of having questions after each speaker, we'll save them all for the Q&A at the end. A couple of reasons for that. I think it's likely that questions might get answered by subsequent speakers, so we'll avoid any duplication there. Also, if you could type your questions in the chat box, which is at the bottom of the screen, you should see a button called chat, and we'll use that mainly for you to type your questions. Again, with so many people on the call, it's quite hard to call on individual people to ask questions and keep track of who's got their hands up and wanting to ask a question. So pop your questions in the chat and I'll ask them on behalf of you all, if that's okay. If we don't get to answer all your questions, and I suspect we might have too many to get through tonight, then I will compile all those questions and I'll send them to the speakers and make sure that you do get an answer in the next week or so. So don't worry too much if we don't manage to get to you tonight. You will get an answer, I promise. So just to run through the running order for tonight, I'm going to give a little brief introduction to the Stepping Stones project, and then we'll move swiftly onto the sort of heart of the matter tonight. So the first section will be a general introduction to conservation grazing and what it is, how it's used. And then we'll have a section on the pros and cons of different grazing animals. And then 3 case studies, a couple of different types of sheep and one on cattle. And then it'll be into the Q&A. And hopefully that will take us nicely up to 8:30. I'll try and keep to time as much as we can. So we'll ensure that we're all out of here as close to 8:30 as we can. So introductions now. We're incredibly lucky tonight to have 3 really knowledgeable speakers about the topic of conservation grazing, some real experts who all happen to live and or work in the Shropshire Hills. First up, we'll have Richard Small. Richard's formerly a lecturer in wildlife conservation, specialising in the use of grazing animals in conservation management. He's now a smallholder managing an area of land for biodiversity using a flock of Hebridean and Manx sheep. Next up, we also have John Bacon, who up until his retirement a few years ago had been involved for over 50 years with grazing management of national nature reserves and sites of special scientific interest throughout the UK, providing advice for a range of organisations, including Natural England and all its precursor organisations, the National Trust, Scottish Natural Heritage, and many others. Now, in the late 90s, Richard and John together were two of the founding members of something called the Grazing Animals Project, or GAP. And this was set up to really encourage and expand the use of rare and traditional breeds and nature conservation sites. GAP ran a range of initiatives and produced various publications, including an online forum that's still active. And I think John will probably touch on that in his section, but I'll also send details and links to those resources and to various things that GAP produced in the follow-up email. The National Trust also uses conservation grazing in its land holdings here in Shropshire, so we're also joined tonight by Patrick Edwards, who's the area ranger for Carding Mill Valley and the Long Mynd. So he's going to talk to us about his experience of working with some Hebridean sheep in the Batch Valley. For those of you who know the area well, you'll know where that is, and you'll probably recognise the sheep as well. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to try and share my screen now, so fingers crossed the technology is on our side tonight. Is that working? Can you see? Can I have some nods? Great, thank you. Okay, so just a few minutes on the Stepping Stones project, which, as I said, is the project that I work on for the National Trust. So the project really is a vision. So it's a 50-year vision, and that vision is for the natural habitats in the Shropshire Hills to be restored, healthy and connected, and for the people who live, work and visit the area to understand, appreciate and support what we're doing to try and rejuvenate the landscape. So I'm going to pick apart exactly what I mean by that over the next few slides. This is a project area, so hopefully most of you are local and recognise the places on this. For those of you who are from a little bit further afield, this is sort of below Shrewsbury, so we're south of Shrewsbury here, north of Ludlow, just to try and orientate yourselves. So yeah, this is a project area. And within that project area, we have two core sites for nature. We have the Long Mynd, which is owned and managed by the National Trust and the commoners. And up here we have the Stones National Nature Reserve, which is managed by Natural England. And these two core sites are really the heart of the project area, but what we're about in the project is to try and think beyond those core sites and think about connectivity and movement of wildlife and species and habitats throughout the project area as a whole. So I've just got 5 main points to make about the project really. The first being that it is a 50-year vision. So we're thinking long term, and it's been developed by a number of organisations and individuals over the past 2 decades really. It's not sprung out of nowhere, it's the result of a lot of thought and work that's gone into it. And we're really taking quite an innovative approach. It's a landscape scale nature conservation project, and we're working in partnership. So although at the moment the National Trust are sort of leading the work, we work in partnership with Natural England, with Shropshire Wildlife Trust and various other organisations, especially the AOMB, the Shropshire Hills AOMB. But we're mainly working outside the boundaries of land that we own and have control of the management of, which is something a little bit different for the National Trust and means that we have to work in different ways. So obviously it's about building relationships with local people, farmers, landowners, local communities and local volunteer groups. And the point of the project really is to restore and create stepping stones of habitats and wildlife corridors between those two core sites of Long Mynd and Stones. So I've got a little infographic which sort of demonstrates that here. And for those of you who've been involved in conservation, you might recommend this mantra of more, bigger, better and joined. So this is taken from the Lawton report, that really influential report that said we need more nature reserves or areas managed for wildlife. they need to be bigger, they need to be better, and they need to be joined up. So you can see that philosophy illustrated here within the Stepping Stones project area. So this is what we're trying to do. It's about creating patches of habitat or stepping stones and joining them up. So we have 5 main habitat types that we're focusing on. We've got species-rich grassland, deciduous woodland, heathland, wetland, and frith, which is a Welsh term for the sort of upland fringe habitat, this sort of scrubby gorse-like habitat, often on steep slopes. And thinking about the sorts of features that might join those up and provide that ecological connectivity throughout the landscape, it's things like streamside wetlands, road verges, essentially long linear meadows, and of course hedgerows, linking patches of woodland. And the reason we're doing all this is because, like in many places across the country, the landscape here in the Shropshire Hills is changing, and many of its characteristic wildlife species are in decline. And this is small pearl-bordered fritillary, which is one of the key species that we're focusing on. And finally, our philosophy is that anyone can help make a difference, whether that's making your garden a stepping stone, volunteering with stepping stones, donating, or getting involved in things like tonight and finding out what's happening in the local area and understanding a little bit more about the work that's being done there. So that's it from me, and I'm going to hand over to Richard now, who's going to kick us off on conservation grazing. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Charlie. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to address the question of why use grazing for the management of sites. And normally, if I was doing this sort of talk to a live audience, I'd ask for suggestions about the sort of habitats that people might value. But given the circumstances of this Zoom type meeting, then I'm going to have to deliver those one after another. So some of the habitats that I think conservation-minded people would value include the lowland heath. In this case, it's in Suffolk, but there are other patches. And the next one is an upland moorland or an upland heathland. Strictly speaking, this is Nipstone, if you don't recognise it. Strictly speaking, I think that's still classified as lowland or somewhere in between, but you get the general idea that there are also upland moorlands which are important. And the next slide shows some chalk downland, and not very common in this area, of course, but so we'll move on quickly to the next one. Again, limestone grasslands aren't terribly common, although there is, of course, Wenlock Edge. This is the Great Orme. You might just be able to see some of the goats which became famous last summer, just in the middle there. But anyway, limestone grasslands. And the next one shows, yeah, it's not my photograph, as I fully acknowledge, but a species-rich hay meadow that Charlie's already mentioned as being one of the priorities for this area. And finally, amongst this sort of group of habitats is pasture woodlands, which should come up there. I think this is the pasture woodland. This is actually on the eastern slopes of the Stiper Stones looking towards the Long Min, so it's well in the Stepping Stones area, but it's representative of the sort of habitat that is called pasture woodland, essentially an open grassland, but with scattered trees. So we've got half a dozen or so habitats there, and as well as being of conservation value, I think what these all have in common is that they were created by or for grazing animals, mainly created by them. But in the case of hay meadows, we would have no purpose for hay meadows if we didn't have grazing animals. So hay meadows are about getting the grazing animals through the winter. Now, they are all open habitats, and I hope you will accept that, you know, we value them. But if any of these habitats are left without management, then they would eventually revert to the woodland that once covered most of the British Isles. And in the photograph here, you can see this is a nice meadow. You might just be able to see some orchids there and some other plants. But you can also see that there's a hedgerow, and in the distance or is some at the beginning of a woodland. And those sources of trees and shrubs are beginning to encroach on the grassland area. So I've highlighted with arrows 3 young shrubs which would develop into trees given time. And this is very characteristic, of course, of habitats that are not managed, that they will eventually succeed. In the process is called succession. They would change over time to become increasingly wooded. And again, this is also between cypress stones and long mind. And in this case, the trees have become much more dense and shrubby. It's a perfectly good habitat, very good for some species. And you might all think, well, aren't trees good? Isn't woodland good? And of course it is. But if we allow this process to continue on all of these habitats, then eventually all we would have probably is woodland and not much else. So it's a question of trying to maintain those other habitats if we think they're important. So there are sort of 3 ways in which we might keep open habitats open if that's what we decide to do. Now, the first of these is cutting. And here's an example of some heathland which is being cut. It's looking, I always think these 2 managers are looking rather forlornly at what they've just done, but perhaps I'm misinterpreting their view. It's a very dramatic change in the habitat. It's done very quickly, and it can cause some animals, if they're slow moving, to be caught up in the cutting process. So there's a risk to some of the animals which are present. Some of the plants are less tolerant of cutting. Heather is fine, it can be cut and will regenerate very, very well. But cuttings can be problematic. It's very sudden and doesn't always give a very nice appearance initially. And it also, as in the next slide, requires some big kit. Now, those of you who know what you're looking at will tell me that tractor is just topping those thistles, but you get the general idea that the tractor and the cutting equipment that's necessary to manage the habitats can be quite large and expensive. And of course, you need the driver to operate the machinery. It's also not easy to use cutting on some habitats if it's very wet, if it's very steep, if it's rocky, or if it's very extensive in some of our upland moorlands. To cut it all would be a very time-consuming process. So cutting may have its place. It's used, for example, on the cypress stones where it's possible, but it may not suit everywhere, and it does have some downsides. So the next option is burning. And again, I should have said about cutting, of course, that cutting is part of the traditional management of hay meadows, and burning is part of the traditional management of many of our upland moorlands, where it's generally referred to as swaling. But again, you know, there are issues perhaps with this. There's still the risk of animals being caught up in this. It's usually done in winter, so many animals are you know, underground or down holes or under rocks or whatever it might be in a safe location. But it is possible that they will be damaged if the burning is not done well. Again, it's a very sort of dramatic change in the habitat, and may not be appropriate where there are housing and so on, that the smoke and the ash that can blow around, and it doesn't look very attractive when it's finished. But it's a feasible process, and again, it's used on the stiper stones, for example. Where cutting's not possible, then burning is used to try to regenerate the heather. But burning and cutting then have their downside and aren't appropriate in every location. So that brings us to the third option, and that's grazing, as you might have gathered. Now, I don't say that grazing is without its issues, but it does have a number of advantages, and you probably would have worked these out from what I've said about the options. But it's a more gradual process for a start. Animals have got time to move out of the way of the grazing animals. They aren't likely to be either trampled or eaten in the process. They can move away or migrate to other areas. Many of the plants are tolerant of grazing, or they have adaptations to mean that they're not grazed readily. I mean, thistles are an obvious example, in which case it means that many plants can survive the grazing process. They may be eaten, but they will often survive, and a wide variety of species can persist. Provided that the stocking density is not too great, grazing can provide a varied structure to the vegetation. So, they have some longer patches, some shorter patches. Cattle are particularly good at creating that variation, often leaving a sort of tussocky grassland, which can be valuable for invertebrates. Beetles can hide amongst the tussocks, for example, or for nesting birds, perhaps, may prefer either the tussocky area or the short vegetation between. In addition, grazing animals can create additional habitats. They can create small patches of bare ground, perhaps through their trampling action. Particularly the heavier animals like cattle and ponies will create some bare ground, and that's important for some plants to germinate, and for some invertebrates. Some of the burrowing wasps, for example, like the bare soil in which to burrow. The dung of the animals can provide another source of food for invertebrates, and again, they will support birds and small mammals. So all in all, grazing animals and grazing as a means of managing habitat has a lot to commend it. It's not without its problems, and particularly when grazing is introduced to a new area, and particularly areas where people are used to walking freely, the need for fences and other infrastructure, there's a cost involved in that, but also there can be problems because people will cut fences if they've been used to walking a particular route, and generally it can cause antagonism amongst the local people. So it has to be addressed very carefully at the outset and to involve local communities. But once you've got them on side, then I think grazing animals add something to the landscape, and in ecological terms, generally they do a very good job of managing habitat. So I think that's all I'd like to say at this point.
Great, thank you, Richard. As I said before, we'll do questions all together at the end in the Q&A. So if you do have any questions for Richard, just pop them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. Okay, John, if you want to unmute yourself, and John's going to talk about the pros and cons of different grazing animals.
Yes, hello all. If I can, the first slide is actually really to just link to what Richard said. I've titled it Deciding on a Grazing Scheme, and because he's described how it depends on what habitats are present and what you feel are valuable, the species that are present, and also what are the bullies that are present. That's rather a gardening phrase, I think, bullies, but it includes scrub, as Richard mentioned. Dominant and vigorous grasses can also be bullies, and not forgetting the agricultural weeds. And really that will help determine when you graze. Is it all the time? Is it spring? summer, autumn, winter, or a mixture of any of those. And I think it's fair to say that grazing for plants is relatively straightforward. You just need to graze it off fairly tight so that the long grasses don't smother the herbs. If you're trying to graze to see flowers in the summer, that adds a level of complication because obviously it's not being kept short as it was all the time, and it's a bit more difficult. If you're trying to manage for not just flowers, but also the insects, the butterflies and the bugs, if you're trying to get it to shimmer, flutter and buzz in the summer, then that adds another level of difficulty to how you do the grazing. Right, next slide, please. So moving on to the pros and cons of different grazing animals. Basically, all of them will do a job. The job that they do will vary considerably, depending on the time of year and the weather conditions. But sheep, cattle, goats, ponies, and I've included pigs and rabbits. We won't talk about pigs today, and hopefully we won't deal with rabbits really either, because they do fluctuate enormously in numbers. So let's move on to sheep, and let's get up close and personal. We have some badger-faced sheep here and some Herdwicks, two traditional native breeds, very hardy animals. And if we see slide 4, this is getting up and personal. Sheep have these bottom incisor teeth which go up against a hard pad, and that's how they rip the grasses off. And you can age the sheep by looking at how big the teeth are and how they're replaced from the centre outwards. And sheep normally keep their teeth for 6 or more years, but if you're getting up to a dozen years, you might find they're losing their teeth and it's slightly more difficult. They are selective graziers. They love eating flowers. They'll go along and pick every single flower off before they'll tackle the grass. And so in fact, they're probably good for autumn grazing and winter grazing when the flowers have finished. And of course, if they graze quite tight, they can in fact reduce invertebrate numbers quite a bit. Next slide. Moving on to cattle quickly. This is a West Highland. They can be heavy animals, but also you can get lightweight cattle. Anything that's 6 to 12 months old can be really quite good. Young animals, and they don't poach the ground nearly so much as these big heavy ones would. Is the next slide, I think, will show getting really up close and personal. They have the same arrangement in the mouth, having bottom incisors going up against a hard pad, but they also have a very, very long tongue. So they don't do so much nibbling, they do a wrap and pull action of the grasses. So they're pretty good for when there are long grass situations. They will take it down quite well, and they'll probably take it down a lot quicker than sheep will. So they don't graze so tight. They are non-selective, so if you've got a lot of flowers, they'll take some, but they won't head for them as a first action. If you've got a very wet season, then their hoof action can cause poaching, but if it's not too wet, their hoof action can actually be really good because they make these little divots in the turf, which for invertebrates, and particularly some of the butterflies, that makes a nice little warm hot spot in the turf, which can be 10 degrees hotter in that little divot than the surrounding vegetation, and that's what some of our butterflies like. So I've always been quite a favourite of cattle, but there we are. We'll come to some problems with them later. Next slide, I think. Moving on to ponies. Exmoors and Conics are the old traditional breeds, but there are a lot more ponies that exist. Dartmoors and all sorts of things. Again, in the next slide, you will see that their mouth is very different. They have teeth top and bottom. So they do a nibbling action, and they can graze very, very tight and very selectively. In fact, they are probably the most selective grazers of all, even picking out individual plants amongst lots of grass. Unfortunately, if they're on a sort of a meadow area, they do tend to have dung and latrine areas where they go to do their daily business, and those areas won't be grazed by them, and in fact they can get pretty rank. So there is a slight problem there. Moving on to goats, here we have some faggots, and these are particularly browsers. They do love standing up, eating bark, eating, just browsing away. I mean, cattle and sheep will also browse, but the goats are really favourites on it, and if you've got a scrub problem, then the goats will deal with them very well. I said I wasn't going to say much about rabbits. They're very nice to look at and watch. Their numbers do fluctuate hugely. They've got two diseases which affect them. That's myxomatosis and also viral hemorrhagic disease. Now in Australia, that picture on the right, I'm glad to say we don't actually see that sort of situation in the UK, but heavily rabbit grazed pastures can get very sick. They will eat very tight and they will leave certain species they don't like. So rabbit grazing really, although it used to occur on chalk grasslands, limestone grasslands way back in the 1950s before myxomatosis hit, it's not really a way of managing a grassland nowadays. So the next slide, as I said, every type of livestock has different management requirements. You've got transporting issues, you've got penning issues. The one on the top left is to do with mostly sheep. The crush on the right would be for ponies and deer if you use deer. So you've got to have a bit of structure in there which is strong enough to hold the stock. You've also got to look at fencing issues, whether it's sheep fencing, netting and a wire, whether you use electric netting or electric cord, which is on the bottom right, and that's driven by either mains or battery controlled devices. There's 5 freedoms. If you're keeping stock, you really should be looking at making sure that they are free from hunger and thirst. So you need to supply daily water. You might need to supply them with some winter additional feed if you've got a lot of snow conditions. The second freedom is freedom from any discomfort. So you would look for sun, shelter from the wind, and escape from the flies in the summer. Freedom from pain, injury or disease, so make sure you keep a good check of them, a daily inspection. Freedom to express normal behaviour, so they've got a big enough area to roam on, and also freedom from fear and distress. So if the public have access to your site, you need to make sure that dogs are kept under control. And finally, Charlie said that I might come back to 2 or 3 things that the GAP project produced. There is a breed profiles handbook if you're interested in other rare breeds. That goes through all the different types of livestock and shows all the main old breeds, which are very good for grazing wildlife sites. We also produced the Guide to Animal Welfare in Nature Conservation Grazing, which is a great help. And also there's a best practice guide to setting up and running locally based cooperatives, which we called local grazing schemes. All these are available on the Rare Breed Survival Trust website, who now host the GAP resources. And if you are interested in joining the Google Group's email forum, which is called Nibblers, it's free to join. If anyone wants to, you can contact me and I'll get you put onto the forum, where nearly 1,000 people across the whole of the UK discuss grazing issues, problems and solutions. So that's about it from me.
Great, thank you very much, John. Okay, so we're going to move straight on to our case studies. We've got three just very brief case studies for you, and then it's Q&A time. So I think we'll start with Patrick, if that's okay with you, Patrick.
Yes, thank you very much, Charlie. That's very pretty. I like that. It's a good start. So yeah, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the Long Mynd and the Hebrideans that we have on the Long Mynd, and why we came to the decision of having the Hebrideans. We started out in the 80s with a mixture of sheep that are predominantly Welsh mulling, and we found that they weren't munching their way through the bramble as much as we liked. We moved on to the Balwyn Welsh Mountain variety, and unfortunately that they didn't flock together. They didn't do what sheep are meant to do, and so we moved away from them, and we moved away to the Hebrideans, which were a good sort of mix of sheep that would flock together. They would eat woody materials, and we started our flock in the early 2000s of Hebrideans. We don't breed from them. We don't lamb from them. It would be a dedicated stock person, and we don't have the time or the resources to do that, so we don't do any of that. We had some of them from Richard. Dave says we had them back in 2006. I don't know if Richard remembers that. We had some lambs, some rams, and one of them is still alive. You'd be pleased to know. They live for about 12, 13, 14 years with us. They never enter the food chain, and they do an excellent job for us, really. As somebody once told Dave, and it's maybe Richard who told Dave, put a Hebridean on a piece of concrete and they'll find something to eat. So it's been really, really good. We feed them, as John was alliterating too. Their teeth do go, like old people, like myself. They're not all real teeth anymore, and sadly, so we have to feed them. So especially during the winter, the Mynd is renowned for slightly inclement weather. And so they check daily. They have their access to the water, the freedoms that John was talking about. And they've been very, very good for us. We describe them as our environmentally sound lawnmowers, which trundle up and down the valley very, very nicely. They keep a lovely short sward, and they're excellent for us, and we move them around. They go down to some of our spots down at Walcott, down on Wenlock Edge, where they were originally sort of purchased to go through all their bramble, limestone grassland glades. And they're just excellent for us. They're all pedigrees. We get them from a retired park ranger from the Brecon Beacons. He breeds them, and they come up and stay with us. Like this one looking at us here now, thinking, "Hey, what are you doing? Taking pictures of me while I'm trying to mate." And they're really very good. You know, they cost about £60 to buy, a couple of bags of feed for the winter, and you know, they live out their lives with us. They have very few vet bills. We have very few issues with them, and yeah, they're very good to look after. And then sadly, we have to take them away and dispose of them through the hunt kennel. We don't join the fallen stock scheme. We don't have enough sheep to make it worth our while. So they just live out their lives, and being excellent little lawnmowers.
Great, thank you, Patrick. I've got some personal experience of these. I've done a couple of days of trying to count them on the daily checks, so I can vouch for the fact it's pretty difficult to try and count sheep when you're not trying to fall asleep at night anyway.
They've become incredibly successful at hide and seek, and you would think that spotting some sort of fuzzy black animals against a green background would be fairly easy, but they're incredible at hiding, and yeah, all credit to them for trying to elude us, except when they can hear the rattle of food, and then they all make themselves very, very known.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Okay, so we're going to stick with sheep for the next case study, and it's back over to John to talk about the badger-faced sheep.
Right, I live on the east end of Raglas Hill, which was the southeast corner of the map that Charlie showed earlier. I've got a couple of acre meadow. My daughter, who lives next door, has got 3 or 4 small meadows. The National Trust has got a meadow nearby. So we've set up a little group amongst us to try and improve the quality of these meadows. The one you're looking at there is completely natural. No seed has been spread on that. And it's really the sort of nice flower meadow, which is full of invertebrates and butterflies, which we're trying to manage. And the things that we're using to manage it are the badger-faced sheep. Again, the traditional breed, very hardy, very easy to manage. They dig through the snow in the winter to get at the grass and virtually refuse any hay. So they are really, really good all the year round. Why have we chosen sheep? Well, because they're easy to look after. They don't need huge fencing. You can bucket train them, so they'll follow you wherever you want to go. They don't drink much water, unlike cattle who can drink 10 gallons a day each. The sheep will barely have just a little sip. So there's lots of things to commend them, although I would much rather actually be managing with some young cattle, because I like the way they graze the pasture better. But there we are, you've got to be practical, and sheep are what we've chosen. So that's how the meadow looks at the beginning of spring. We get it off really tight and short, so that the herbs and the flowers can grow without being smothered during the summer. We then leave it all summer and don't graze it. We let the flowers come, we let the butterflies come, and we then graze it in the autumn and winter, and increasingly we're having to graze it in the spring, because the mild winters that we get and the extra rainfall that we've been getting mean that the grass keeps on growing all winter, which is really annoying and makes a lot more work, and in fact risks losing a nice tight herb-rich sward if we don't keep the grasses under control. Right, Charlie. So the management that we do, daily inspection, make sure there's water. We do provide mineral and vitamin licks, a salt lick, as well as something often called rumavite, which supplies them with the minerals they need. We make sure they've got shade and shelter. We do foot inspections at least every 3 monthly. And we also have, of course, to do the shearing. Yeah, that's in May, June. We're lucky we found someone from Acton Scott Farm Museum who does their sheep and who does ours at the same time. That could be a problem if we didn't have him. After shearing, there's always the risk of summer fly strike, so you have to be ready to do a pour on. And we actually move them, their pastures and the bit they're on, every 3 weeks, because they're bucket trained. That's easy. Move them onto new pastures so as to avoid any worm buildup. Most of the worms that sheep have up to a 3-week rotation life cycle, and that saves us having to use the anthelmintics, which of course in the dung can cause problems to the invertebrates. So quite a few things there to consider. And yes, these meadows have over 100 flower species in the summer. And not just flowers, but there's a six-spot burnet moss, the dark green fritillary, and the grasshoppers. So we like the meadows to be floristically really enjoyable. We like them to hum, buzz and whiz. We wouldn't, if we didn't want all the extra flowers and butterflies and insects, we could actually just keep grazing it all year round, and the herbs and the plants would still be there in a short turf, but you wouldn't have quite so much to enjoy and stand and watch and pass the time with. So that's basically the result that we get using our badgerface sheep.
Great, thank you, John. And it is a stunning place. So any of you who haven't been to Ragleth Hill in summer and seen the meadows, I definitely recommend that for May, June, July time this year. Okay, it's back to Richard now. So Richard is going to go into a bit more detail about using cattle. He's not going to talk about any one specific case study, but as I say, just add a bit more detail to the use of cattle.
Okay, thank you. Just to go back to a point you made earlier, Charlie, when you're counting sheep, the old joke is that the way to do it is to count the legs and divide by 4. So anyway, more seriously, yeah, grazing with cattle. As Charlie says, I haven't got a local case study, although there is a local group that uses cattle, and I'll come back to that at the end. But maybe if any of members of that, I suppose you call it a local grazing scheme, if any of them are on the call, as it were, then if they make themselves known through the chat, it would be good for them to say what they can about what they do. I was just going to start by again, John's touched on this, by talking about cattle, and although they can survive perfectly well on a grass diet, they are derived from the now extinct European wild cattle, or auroch, which were essentially woodland animals, and consequently cattle can, and will browse particularly leaves and green twigs, not as much as John said goats do, but I think we need to bear in mind that cattle are derived from these forest animals. But what I'm going to do then is just look at some of the breeds really that are used in conservation grazing, and their examples taken from all over the country. So the next one should show some Dexters. Great. Okay. These two, I think they're Dexter are a relatively small breed of cattle, as John said. He was talking about young cattle, but we can also have smaller breeds, so they're lighter on their feet and so on. And Dexters are one of those breeds which are relatively small. And these particular ones are on a Shropshire Wildlife Trust site, which is on the next slide. This is Button Oak Meadow, a relatively recent site. It doesn't look much there. This was taken in spring. You can just see the Dexter cattle in the far distance. It's a nice wildflower meadow when the wildflowers are out, but unfortunately, you can't see them there. So that's, as I say, Button Oak Meadow on the Shropshire-Worcestershire border. This is another breed which is widely used in conservation grazing, English Longhorns. In this case, they're on the Steart marshes in Somerset, the coastal grazing marshes. And then the next slide shows some Shetlands. Again, small cattle. These are relatively young, but they are small cattle even when mature. These are on the same site. this is Freshfield Dune Heath, which is a Lancashire Wildlife Trust site. It's the same site as the Hebrideans in the very first slide of this of my previous chat. So Shetlands are really quite rare compared to the other two breeds we've seen, but one of the most common breeds used in conservation grazing is the next one, which are belted Galloway. These are on the Cotswold escarpment, so looking down the steep slope across the land beyond. One of their advantages is supposed to be that even on sort of foggy days or in twilight in winter, they stand out. You can pick out the white belts even if you can't see the head and tail of the animal. So they're quite widely used. And the next slide, John's already mentioned Highland cattle. I'm not sure where these are, to be, if I'm quite honest, but it is a conservation site. So these are just some of the breeds which are used in conservation. Highland, I should say, are used by Trevor Wheeler, who manages the Shropshire Wildlife Trust site at Ross Fiddle in the Clun Hills. But Highland and Dex are also used by this local group that there are at least 4 people involved in it. Most of the stock management is done by Chris Gethin, and he did arrange with Shropshire Wildlife Trust to graze a lot of their sites. So he, that became his job, was managing animals all around their sites. But that was knocked back as a result of COVID last year, about this time last year. And now the animals, as far as I know, only graze Nipstone and Earl's Hill, just outside of Pontesbury. But hopefully, as I say, maybe one of that group or more are on and might say some more. They've also got Hill Radnor sheep, but I'm supposed to be talking about cattle. Unfortunately, despite walking past their cattle almost every day, I haven't got any photographs of them, but there it is. That's something I must put right on the next sunny day. Okay, thanks, Charlie.
Great, thank you, Richard. I'm going to stop sharing now. Okay, so we'll move on to the Q&A. So just catch up with this. So yeah, we've got a question about Raglath, John. Someone, I think Lucy, is asking, what size of flock do you have at Raglath to get the results that you've shown? And over what period did you get the results? So how long did it take to establish the habitat?
Right, we've got a huge flock of 8 sheep. In fact, unfortunately, we have lost one. It had GID, which is a tick in the brain. So we're now down to 7. So they do need fairly careful management. The total acres is somewhere around 6, 7 acres. But luckily, my daughter's got some layback grassland, which isn't species rich. So if we run short, they can go there. But also the National Trust, we're working on their meadow. That they take a hay crop off that at the moment, and we just put some seed on there last autumn. And so we're starting to graze that as well in the autumn, winter and spring. So that's basically it, just a few sheep.
Great, thanks, John. Another question from Stephen. To what extent, sorry, this is for you again, John. To what extent are those 5 freedoms that you mentioned enshrined in law? The 5 freedoms, the Grazing Animals Project developed them in association with some vets, and they were recommended best practice. I think it's been overtaken by animal welfare laws since then, but as a livestock owner, you're obliged to make sure that your animals are
healthy and happy. I'd say I was just going to say that, yes, there are welfare codes which are produced by DEFRA, and they are stated in there, as John's indicated, that they may not actually be in legislation, but it's one of these things that you're obliged to abide by the code of welfare, and they're in the code. So indirectly, I think we're all bound by them.
Great, thank you. We also had a question sent in advance via email. That was about managing a meadow that had an area full of tumps, so kind of lumpy with anthills, quite steep-sided, and so unsuitable for mowing. So it was just a question really about how to manage that, whether there was a certain type of grazing animal that would be more suitable for that kind of lumpy, uneven sort of area.
So I'd have a go at this. I'm sure John will come back as well. The lumps, the tumps, are they're meadow ants, yellow meadow ants, which aren't in themselves, I don't think, a particularly rare species or anything like that, but they do show when a meadow has been kept as grassland for a long time. The bigger the ant nest, the longer it's been unploughed, because ploughing will get rid of the ants, as it were. So it's an indication really of historic grassland. The particular site is a bit awkward for that reason. I mean, I think both John and I would normally say all cattle grazing would be ideal for that, except for the ant mounds. And the cattle will probably be heavy enough to damage those ant mounds, which can in themselves be important, because being a drier habitat, because they're well drained, you do get some different plants often growing on those than you do in the general grassland roundabout. So they should be retained if possible. Sheep, unfortunately, though, whilst they do less damage, are less effective in that particular situation. We haven't got all the details here, but I have sort of commented on this site before to the owner. But anyway, I think that's probably all I can say. Is ponies would be another possibility, but again, they're probably as heavy as cattle pretty well. So I haven't got an easy answer. John, have you got any thoughts?
Yes, I have seen chalk grassland sites with loads of anthills, which have been successfully grazed by cattle. Okay. So long as the anthills are active, they will repair the damage in the summer with any hoof that's gone through it. But it does, basically, the example you're saying there is, it just adds another level of complication to having flowers and then all the butterflies and the bees and invertebrates. I've found we've got some anthills on one or two of our meadows, and the sheep do actually intend to go and graze them first before they'll eat any of the grassland around. So I think it all depends on what species of plant you've got on the anthills. But it is a tricky one. It'd be quite nice to have a look at the site in the flesh, as it were, and to sort of perhaps have a discussion as to what can be done. But it does add another level of complication to managing.
We should perhaps say that again, the ant hills are the reason that it shouldn't be mown. And I think in the situation we're talking about, what they would like to do is to allow the vegetation to grow long during the summer so that they get the wildflowers and so on. But then in the autumn and early winter, to crop it back, as John said, he does at Raglith, to a tight sward. And that's the issue. We don't want it, or we would not recommend cutting because of the damage to the anthills. John's saying the cattle would be all right, so I would now go with that if he's happy with that. But sheep, the problem with using sheep in that situation is that they don't like the very long vegetation that's left in the autumn. they prefer short vegetation that's constantly cropped.
Great, thank you. I'm aware of time, so I think we'll just do 2 more questions. Patrick, one for you that came in via email, specifically about the management at Hopesay Common. So the question was, might the plans for Hopesay Common include sheep in the future rather than cattle, given that the cattle on the steep sides can cause quite a lot of churning and poaching? So question for you.
Yeah, so the decision to go with cattle on Hopesay was basically because a lot of the lower fences at Hopesay, we cannot guarantee a stock proof for sheep, whereas the cattle will stay away a little bit from, you know, the single strand. So we couldn't guarantee. It's very, very wet at the slopes, at the bottom of the slopes of Hopesay. So it'd be very difficult for us to get access and repair some of those fences. So we decided to go for cattle, a bit of an experiment. We've also got bracken on some of the slopes there. And it's a bit of an experiment to try and deal with a little bit of bracken, although we cut some with our tractor and we have used RoboCutter on there. There's quite a large cost to hiring a RoboCutter, and so it was seen as to use cattle as a bit of an experiment. We probably just didn't get it quite right last year, probably had a few too many cattle on and just kept them on a bit too late. So this year they're going to be on less and they'll be monitored a little bit more. But as John said, you know, they create that little bit of a hoof. You get that little microclimate. You know, the ground, it doesn't need to be, you know, like a bowling green. Some divots here and there are good. Some bare earth is good. So it's, you know, it's, yes, there was a little bit of churning up, but nothing that we're overly worried about. And in terms of anthills, if anybody's been to the batch or walked past, you will see that one of the fields is dimpled like a golf ball with anthills. And the Hebrideans do like to do a little bit of topiary now and then. And so the anthills are kept lovely and nicely presented. And they will munch their way around, but it's their least favoured of their 3 fields that they can have access to.
Great, thanks, Patrick. And a question for John about Raglath again. Do you cut the meadow there for hay?
No, most of the meadows are only grazed. We do take flower seed, or have done this last winter, off some of them, and we've used the Marches Meadow Group's seed harvester, brush seed harvester. And then we've been spreading that up on the National Trust meadow, which has got a relatively small number of species on it, and we're trying to improve that. So the National Trust meadow has a hay cut, did this last year. In fact, it was silage, not hay, because it was a bit late season. So it's mostly just the grazing. My own meadow, the sheep didn't get back to it in the late summer as I'd wanted. So in fact, I had to do a little bit of trimming just recently, and got the ride-on mower out to take it off nice and short. So it varies. Each season is different actually. Depends on how much rain you get. How much last spring we had that drought, and there was no growth at all. And then you get a wet winter and it's all growing long and rank. So you've just got to be very flexible. There's no, you can't actually plan at the beginning of the year. You've got to react to the weather.
Great, thank you. Just a final comment in the chat from Mike about cattle really. He says, we need more cattle. But conservation breeds of cattle are a huge step up from sheep in terms of cost, risk and hassle. You've got to think about things like TB, passports, transport costs, handling kit. But conservation breeds are less productive than other breeds. So stock owners, especially young new entrant farmers, need support to help set up with these types of breed. They provide a service to landowners, especially hobbyists. Should that be paid for? How can they best be supported? So I don't know whether anyone has any final thoughts on that, or whether that's a sort of thing to ponder and maybe come back to it at a future date. Yeah, I think John wants to jump in there.
Yeah, just to say that the Grazing Animals Project local grazing schemes, the best practice approach, and it really occurs to me it'd be marvellous if we could find some young farmers in this area who were interested in setting up a local grazing scheme, because it seems to me the Stepping Stones project would just really love to have that resource at its beck and call.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm sure that is something that we'll come back to and talk more about. It's a great idea. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end. Obviously, it's just been really a taster tonight. We've only had an hour or just over an hour, and I think we've barely scratched the surface of this. So, as I say, I will be sending a follow-up email. So if you want to hear more about conservation grazing in the future, or if there's any particular part that you feel we should have a session on and really go into more detail, then you know, use that chance to let me know, and we can always have a session again on this topic in the future. So just really to say thank you, especially to our speakers and to everyone who asked a question. Expect a follow-up email in the next few days, so that will include some links, further information, and as I've mentioned, a request for some feedback. Also, a bit of information about the Marchers Meadow Group, who are a group operating over the Marchers area, but are particularly active in Shropshire and in the Stepping Stones area. And if you're interested in meadows, meadow management, meadow creation, even at a garden lawn scale, then yeah, you'll find the Marchers Meadow Group a really interesting and useful group to join. So I think that's everything. It just leaves me to say thank you everyone for attending, and hope to see you at the next one. Right, take care everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Charlie.
Well, you said that good. I've got to unmute myself.
Charlie and everyone.